Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. So what I'm going to talk to you about today is this kind of wacky idea I had a few months ago of looking at blockchain networks in a little bit of a different way, using kind of high-level and descriptive analytics to try and do comparative analysis of networks that share a common origin. So that's what I'm about to talk about. A little bit about me. I used to be a science kid, astronomer, photophysicist. I got into experimental music and arts, spent 10 years curating and messing around with weird and wonderful creative technologies. And then I fell down the cryptocurrency rabbit hole 6 years ago. All right. So what the hell is Forkonomy? And we're going to draw an analogy with astronomy. So what's astronomy? Astronomy is using the light from stars, from objects far away, to try and reach inferences and understanding without being able to directly observe things. And so in the bottom right-hand corner of the slide, there's something called the Hertzsprung-Russell diagram. And this is a way to classify stars based on how hot they are, their temperature, and how bright they burn. And if you use these two parameters, you have quite a good idea of estimating the probabilities of the future fates of those stars, whether that star will collapse in on itself and become a black hole or a neutron star, or if it will fail to retain its mass and everything will disappear and it'll become a white dwarf. Now, this sounds not very related to blockchains, but bear with me. So we had a little bit of a primer on Newton earlier. That's great, because I actually went to the same secondary school as Isaac Newton. Or he went to the same school as me, let's say. And so you can take astronomy a step further if you do what Newton's doing in the slide, where he's diffracting this light into its constituent components, its constituent wavelengths. And so the analogy that I like here is that we can use analytics to go a step further than simple observation. All right. And this is some work that I did as an astrochemist 15 years ago. You don't need to read too much into it, just nice, pretty pictures. But the point of the relation to here is that these were experiments that we did on the ground. We were trying to model the conditions in interstellar space. And obviously, we can't just go to space and check out what's going on there. So if you can model and simulate conditions and then compare with your observation and your analysis, then you can kind of have an apples-to-apples comparison of whether what you think is going on correlates with the reality. All right. So what Forkonomy isn't. This is just a wacky idea I had a few months ago. So it's not a comprehensive catalog of all the different kinds of forks that may or may not be possible. It's not a taxonomy as such yet. Maybe one day, with any of your help, that would be great. So, to say a little bit about what forks are. Now, I guess that most people in the room have probably come across the idea of cryptocurrency network forks. After all, that's a big part of where Ethereum Classic came from. And earlier in the day, we had some very nice primers on the different kinds of forks. So let's start with code-based forks. I think this is one of the easiest things to understand. This is a bit like copying and pasting a piece of software or forking a GitHub repo. So you're essentially taking a static piece of software, reproducing it, changing it as you wish. I mean, these are usually open source code bases. And the canonical example really is the Linux kernel, the open source operating system, which is now fragmented into so many thousands of different children, descendants, that it's even difficult to keep track of. And on the right, we've got an example of some kind of code-based fragmentation of a cryptocurrency protocol family, which is the CryptoNote protocol, which was Bitcoin was the first member of that, and Monero is probably the most famous example. So in comparison to code-based forks, we've got ledger forks, which are more like the things that we see in these cryptocurrency networks. So for example, when Ethereum became Ethereum and Ethereum Classic, or Bitcoin became Bitcoin and Bitcoin Cash, and so on. So this is more of a dynamic process where, as these blockchains are built block by block, there's the chance for forks to happen as multiple miners or validators find candidate blocks that are potentially valid, and then there's a race to propagate those across the network to see which one the network agrees upon. And so when one subset of nodes changes the rules or introduces another change, a parameter or consensus tweak, you can end up with fragmentation of the networks. You can end up with two networks instead of one. Now, this is usually considered to be negative sum if you think about networks being valued roughly in accordance with Metcalfe's law. But that doesn't have to be the case, as we may see later. And so there's certain phenomena which might occur as a result of these ledger forks, such as replay attacks, chain reorganizations, and wipeouts. Haven't really got time to talk about those, but some of those were at risk, Ethereum Classic was at risk of, or they happened to Ethereum Classic in the early days of its life. All right, water break. That's a real picture from my lunch one day, by the way. And so Dionysius gave a great talk about, and in his questions, he split down the differences between hard, soft, and velvet forks much better than I ever could, so thank you. And okay, you might recognize some of these images as being slightly similar to copyrighted TV shows and movies, which have to do with time travel, parallel dimensions, and that's the kind of analogy I'd like to, for us to bear in mind. Think about these different network forks as kind of parallel dimensions. So, what makes a fork? I mean, as we said, we have this kind of block-by-block dynamic, but most of the time, the two candidate blocks, one of them will be discarded, and then everyone will build on one of the particular chains. So you do need a certain set of conditions to arise and occur for a viable minority network fragment to arise from a fork. So this is a really interesting example from the early days of Ethereum Classic, and there's a prominent miner named Chandler Quo, and these two tweets are a week apart in July 2016, and at one point he was saying that he was going to attack Ethereum Classic, and then a week later he said he's going to defend it. And just for an idea, the hash rate he's talking about here is equivalent to several thousand graphics cards, so not insubstantial amount of hash rate. You may recognize some of the faces on this slide as well. So people that were involved at the very start of Ethereum, such as Charles Hoskinson, came out as vocal supporters of Ethereum Classic. And obviously, the work that IOHK does to build on top of Ethereum Classic and develop the ecosystem with clients and other technologies is testament to that continued support. Now, I don't want to spend too long talking about Bitcoin politics. I'm sure you're all quite familiar with this. But the survival of a minority network fragment usually relies on some well-resourced stakeholders, you could say. So the people in this picture have quite a bit of hash rate, quite a bit of mind share, media outlets, and so on. And that helps to increase awareness and increase the legitimacy and the viability of a fork, and that it be accepted as a valid minority fragment. Now, I like this diagram. I call it a chain dynamics visualization. So on the x-axis, you've got chain time, which is the block height. And on the y-axis, you've got Earth time, the time on your wall clock or your calendar. And so with these blockchains, we expect fairly regular inter-block times. So you'd expect this line to be pretty much straight. Now, the blue one is Bitcoin, and the red one is Bitcoin Cash. So you can see one of them is quite straight with a few wobbles, and the other one is much less straight. So the story, paraphrased, goes that when Bitcoin Cash was born, it inherited the Bitcoin difficulty without all of the Bitcoin hash rate. So it was very slow blocks for quite some time. And then some difficulty algorithm adjustments were made, which led to much faster block times. And that was perhaps used as a way to incentivize miners to come over to the minority chain and to keep it being viable. And ultimately, the upshot is that Bitcoin Cash is now 7,000 blocks or so ahead of Bitcoin. And that puts it on track to reach its halving a little bit before the main chain. And in the bottom right-hand corner, you've got the difficulties of Bitcoin and Bitcoin Cash networks. And you can see that there's quite a big difference in those now. I don't want to say too much about this, just that being a minority network fragment can be tough. As Rob from Horizon talked about earlier with the 51% attacks on their network, minority fragments with commoditized hash rate, with ASIC hash rate, can be vulnerable to malicious adversaries doing things like double spending at exchanges or other kinds of attacks, selfish mining, and so on. So there's this interesting thing that happened earlier this year, which gave us a nice data point to look into the future of certain kinds of networks. There was this operation called a fork merge, which took two networks, histories, UTXO sets, their transaction ledgers, and merged it into one. So they took the Z-Classic network and the Bitcoin network, and they merged them into the so-called Bitcoin private network. Now, what's interesting about this is, this is the emission schedule of Bitcoin-like coins over time. Each step is one of the subsidy halvings that's paid out to the miner. Now, what's nice about these coins is that they're roughly, you can put them on the same chart, essentially. The block times on Z-Classic and Bitcoin private are 4 times faster than in Bitcoin, but then the subsidy is commensurate. So by creating this sort of synthetic fork of these merged UTXO sets, you've ended up with a coin that's actually a halving ahead of Bitcoin. Now that's interesting because Bitcoin's the oldest of these networks. So this is kind of a glimpse into a possible future of Bitcoin. Now, some interesting things happened with this fork. By generating this merge, they ended up with a coin with only 500,000 of the 21 million supply left as available as a mining subsidy. So you've only got a subsidy of 1.5625 BTCP per block. The fiat token price is pretty low. I just checked it earlier. It is $3. And as a result, there's not that much of an incentive for miners to defend this chain. So because Equihash, the algorithm that Z-Classic and Bitcoin Private use, now has ASICs, so there's commodity hash rates, fairly cheap and readily available, even rentable on things like NiceHash. That means it's just trivial to attack this chain, 51% it, and attempt to double spend at exchanges. I checked the figures today, and it's now $100 an hour to 51% attack this network. So have a think about that. If it only costs $100 an hour to disrupt this network, it's very hard to see a store of value or even a payments medium of exchange proposition there. And maybe some changes might need to be implemented. The one that Rob mentioned with the chain selection rule might be interesting. Things like what Dogecoin did, merge mining, checkpoint notarization, such as Komodo, or even a proof of stake. So this is just a little bit of a price chart. You can see here Z-Classic is the main chart in red and green, and Bitcoin Private is in purple. So it's quite an unnatural looking chart. The first, can I use this? Yes, around here, that's actually when Zcash, which now became Horizon, was born. And the second one is where Bitcoin Private was born. So this coin actually had a 100-fold increase in value during this period from here to here in USD terms. And Bitcoin Private is now down 98.5%. So I guess what goes up must come down eventually. So there's the recent comparison of Bitcoin Private and Z-Classic. So it seems that the market consensus is that Bitcoin Private doesn't have a great deal of value proposition. All right, so let's come back to this stellar analogy. And I'm going to call Bitcoin Private a white dwarf chain. So what that means is, because we've merged these UTXO sets, we've got this full ledger, we haven't got a subsidy for the miners, and there's no transaction fee market on the chain. It's not being used for high-volume payments to bribe the miners. It means that hash rate is tiny, 51% attacks are trivial, and the TLDR is that mating these chains together looks like it's wrecked Bitcoin Private. All right, let's talk about Ethereum Classic. So we've already spoken a bit about the DAO and things like that. So I don't want to go too much into it, except to say that it's a subject we'll probably come back to tomorrow on the censorship resistance and immutability panel. And this is I'm going to show you a few slides from a colleague's work, Theodore Beutel, from his MSc dissertation at the University of Edinburgh, where he's looking at what DAOs can offer in the future. And this is a little bit of a call to arms for the Ethereum Classic ecosystem. I hope that there's not a bad feeling about DAOs simply because of what happened in history. I think DAOs have the potential to be one of the killer apps of cryptocurrency and blockchain technology. Maybe not now, but in time. So if you can align the incentives and decentralize the decision-making or the power and decentralize the competence, you have the chance of making these open, free-form, permissionless systems which can kind of turn the traditional company hierarchies on their head, perhaps even make them obsolete. Another pretty picture. So let's look at some comparative analysis of Ethereum Classic and Ethereum and see how they might have diverged in the time since the hard fork. So here's the chain dynamics figure again. And the hard fork happened around 1.92 million blocks. So that was, I don't know if you'll be able to see it now. You won't. It's about 2 E06 on that graph. And the chain dynamics remained pretty constant until much later. So they only really changed around the time of the parity bug in Ethereum, enhance. Okay, that's around the time of the Ethereum DAO exploit. Enhance, that's the parity bug. So you can see when you see these kinks in the chain dynamics, that's a change in the inter-block time average, the relationship between chain time and Earth time. And that's when Ethereum Classic removed the difficulty bomb. Now for some cool graphs with way too many data points on them. This was the second or third attempt of trying to put every single block on a chart. Now that's 6 million-ish for Ethereum and 6 million-ish for Ethereum Classic. I had to undersample this by a factor of 100 so you could actually see something. But what's nice about this is you can kind of get a feeling for the utilization of the network over time. So, you know, as these Ethereum and Ethereum Classic are kind of generalized computational engines, the gas use per block is kind of a proxy for the demand for block space, you could say, or computational resource on the network. So this is a nice visual indicator to show that the gas limit per block has been increased in Ethereum, but it hasn't been in Ethereum Classic. You can see the Ethereum Classic one here. I've got another one of these big data charts here with the gas used versus the difficulty of the network. Now what's interesting about this one is you can kind of see these gaps in the chart. Now what that's telling you is that there's been moments in time when the difficulty increased very rapidly. And you can see that if you do this logarithmic comparison of the difficulties. So you can see points at which the Ethereum Classic difficulty increased quite a lot. Okay, let's talk about supply, kind of the monetary characteristics of these networks. So Ethereum Classic had a hard fork not so long ago to initiate a monetary policy with a fixed maximum supply to asymptotically reach that. Kind of similar to Bitcoin-like networks, but without this stepwise halving. And now Ethereum has a higher inflation, but that is due to change with EIP 1234, which has been recommended for implementation by the Ethereum developers. That would take the block reward from 3 to 2 per block. And Casper, in its current form, is expected to reduce the block reward from 2 to 0.6 Ethereum per block. So those figures are subject to change. And again, supply issuance here. The Ethereum one is likely to change once these upgrades are implemented. So where are we going? Where to now for Ethereum Classic? So if Ethereum is going to go to proof of stake, and Ethash A6 and FPGA bit streams are coming online, the mining DAG size can be reduced to enable greater plurality of devices to mine Ethereum Classic. The sidechains, as we've already heard, formal methods as developed by IOHK, multiple developer teams, and the other characteristics. We have the prospect that Ethereum Classic may be the most thermodynamically secure smart contract network on the block. On the flip side, there are some other things which I would like the ecosystem to consider, such as mining pool centralization. I believe it's not quite as bad as it's been, but there are still some mining pools which control or aggregate quite a large proportion of the hash rate. I'd really like everyone to look at Phil Diane's work on frontrun.me, where he's looking at gas arbitrage and miner front running on Ethereum, but these things are also applicable to Ethereum Classic. There's still some question marks over the DAO attacker and the Robin Hood group remnants, what they might do, what they might still have up their sleeves. There's been some discussion of a potential proof of work change further down the road. There's always going to be legacy issues. I mean, I believe the EVM is only being formally audited, code audited now. So who knows what we might find in the back of the cupboard. I also wonder about the governance and decision-making in Ethereum Classic. I'd really like to see more kind of forums, transparent public fora, which connect the various parts of the ecosystem so that everybody can see how decisions are made in terms of the future of the network. And yes, I'd like to see some DAOs at some point as well. All right, so just to close up, I just want to give you the idea that blockchains, as well as being proof machines, they're also time machines. So they have their own sort of internal synchronicity. And as a result, if we can find these interesting data points, these anomalies like Bitcoin Private, they'll give us a chance to peer into the possible futures of these networks. And this is quite a younger project, but I wonder if there's some of the smaller Ethereum-based networks, like Ella, Pearl, Ubic, and so on, which may provide some interesting data points for Ethereum and Ethereum Classic's future. And that's it. So there's a link to a manuscript being prepared at the moment, the link to the slides at the bottom. I'm an independent researcher, just left the university, so I'm trying to find a way to keep the lights on. So if you want to sponsor, collaborate, or discuss, feel free to get in touch. And thanks very much.
Awesome. Thanks, Wassim. So does anybody have any questions? Come on, somebody's got to have a question. I got to go for the question again? OK, I'll do the question. So where's your research taking you next? Like, what are you looking at next in terms of forks, behavior of different blockchains,
So this is just one of half a dozen or so projects that I'm working on. This particular project, I need to really delve a bit deeper into the Equihash ecosystem. Maybe that's something I should speak to Rob from Horizon about, to try and get into the nitty-gritty of how that ecosystem plays out in terms of how the hash rate competition goes and what that has in terms of implications. I'm working on some projects to do with asymmetries in the governance of DAOs that run treasuries in masternode-based systems. Also looking at ways that we can widen participation using cryptocurrencies by increasing the resilience of the software that's used with the explicit goals of censorship resistance and anti-coercion. And yeah, a whole bunch of other stuff.
Awesome. Looking forward to it. All right. Thank you very much.